Hi guys, and welcome back. This is James, and today we are going to be restoring this small little leather builder's bag or plumber's bag. I found this at a junkyard or flea market, more or less, for €6 and decided that I wanted to see if I could restore it as best as possible. As you can see, it's not in great condition, and it doesn't look amazing. It's had things spilt on it, it's been enormously scratched and bumped around, and the leather is incredibly dry, as you can see on the corners there. And the idea here was to restore it and see if I could bring it back up to its, not necessarily its former glory, but at least bring it back up to something that I wouldn't be too ashamed of carrying around and that someone, me or someone else, could use for the next X following years to come. So we'll see. Ultimately though, the word restoration may be overly ambitious for what actually happens in this video, as most of it, as you'll see, is just rebuilding the front flap and making sure the leather gets really good oil. Indeed, the leather was very dry, very dry, and it was starting to crack and even tear at some areas. So most of the work will be, in fact, just redoing the front flap and yeah, giving that leather the good old nourishment and the love it deserves, basically, because it's nice thick leather. So obviously the first thing that I will do here is clean it all up and make sure I get as much as the gunk and muck off as possible. I also decided to go ahead and give it a good coat of, it's basically saddle soap, Fibing saddle soap, and you're supposed to get it to froth the soap, and I didn't manage to get the soap to froth, simply because I think that the leather was so dry, it was just sucking everything in immediately, absolutely immediately. A lot of the stains, unfortunately, I wasn't able to do anything about them, for several reasons. First of all, I don't actually know what these are. I don't know what these stains are, so I wouldn't know how to start treating it. And secondly, I was afraid that if I did try and do something about the stains, that I would actually take away some of the, I don't know, the character of the bag. It's never going to be a perfect bag anyway. It's a €6 bag. You don't need it to be perfect, and you don't want to spend too much time restoring it either, because it's not going to be worth your while. But I did want to make it as good as possible, and I decided that, well, I was going to get rid of the paint, but I wasn't going to try and touch most of those marks, as I simply didn't know how to do it, what they were, and I didn't think it was worth it. As I mentioned, the main part of this bag is the rebuild actually is going to be figuring out what I want to do with it. Originally I wanted to change the straps completely and redo most of it, but in the end, the biggest part and the only part that really needed a change was the front flap. As you notice, the attachments for the buckles were dead and had to be replaced anyway, and the front flap had warped and the leather had stretched, which meant that it was actually wider on the ends than it was at the base of the flap, if that makes any sense, which means that even if I had been able to restore as they were, the attachments for the front closing mechanisms, basically, they wouldn't have been lined up anymore with the initial closing clasps that are on the body of the bag. I do apologize if I am not using the right terminology here, but I'm trying my best. Anyway, I decided to rebuild the front flap mostly, and one of the main things I wanted was that the current flap only overlaps just over the top of the bag. But it means that if ever it's raining or something like that, your bag is actually not completely weather sealed. It's not completely, not weather sealed, but it's not completely enclosed. And I really wanted the front flap to have a sort of box mechanism to it, where once the flap was closed, that there was no way anyone or anything could get into your bag. Which is why I'm making these kind of winglets that will go and wrap around the front of the bag, and hopefully this will work out quite well. I was actually quite happy with the result. As always, I'm using vegetable tanned leather. This is not leather made from vegetables. You'd be surprised how many people who are new to the craft or don't know anything about the craft think that tan leather has got something to do with vegetables. It does, but only in the tanning process. The leather is still leather, good old-fashioned leather. I am using, as always, Fibing's Pro Dye or Oil Dye. I believe this is British saddle, bridle or something like that. And I'm trying to get a color that will match as close as possible the final result. This is going to look much darker than the bag currently is, but bear in mind that's because the leather of the bag is very, very dry. By the end, I am very happy with the choice of colors here, as I find it really does work well with the final bag. As always, I will start by giving my veg tan leather a good coat of neat soot oil, just to make sure it's nice and pliable, just not too dry, basically, before I start applying the dye. And after I've applied the dye, I will go ahead and give it a coat of polish. And I do use basic shoe polish, nothing fancy here, just basic shoe polish. And I find that this works amazingly well at giving me a gorgeous result on my leather. I'm pretty sure this is probably not how most professionals would do it, but it's been working really well for me in the last 2 years. I've had no complaints whatsoever about this method. The big issue, though, however, I would say, is make sure you get as much of the polish off as possible, as you don't want it to get on your clothes or anything else. Right now I'm going to be sticking 2 pieces of leather together in order to make the front attachment clasps nice and thick. This is just 2 offcuts from the same piece of veg tan leather. Give it that good old bond, the cement glue, and let it dry, and yeah, there we go. We'll come back to that later, but right now we're having a look at the winglets here. As you can see, I've folded those down, and that's going to attach to the top of the bag right here, which I am marking out now to figure out where I want to start gluing stuff. Overall, this wasn't too complicated, just measured out the top of the bag, the front of the bag, and try and guessed my way as to where everything should be. Ultimately, the final glue up went okay, except it's not as perfect as I would want it, but to be honest, I'm very happy with the result nonetheless. That line I've scribed just there was to help me figure out where I wanted to place my glue, and I am making sure that the surface is scratched up as possible, so the glue has something to stick to, as simple as that. That way the glue will bond really nicely to the leather, and we should have a perfect fit up. Now, I mentioned the scribe line I'd made. The issue I had was when I glued up the front flap, I only glued it up to the scribe line, which is in theory what you want to do, except that when the flap is closed, you can actually see the scribe line at the top of the leather that has been glued upon it, which is not great, really. So next time, small learner's tip that I have for myself before having it for you guys, because I'm learning as well here, is make sure that any scribe lines are clearly under the second layer of leather that you've been sticking onto it. Same again here, it's just basic leather glue, nothing too fancy. It's some cement glue, which works really well. I've had no complaints whatsoever about this. Again, I'm really happy with the way it holds onto the leather. As you know, you're not going to be gluing on those winglets, so just be careful where you put the glue. And this is what it looks like once it's been secured. From the inside at least. And you can see the holes where I took out the previous rivets. I was worried that these holes would get in the way of the next set of rivets, but and I wasn't too sure if I wanted to rivet through the same holes or how I was going to do it. In the end, you'll see that I just went ahead and did what I felt needed to be done, and those holes, even though they are still there and they're not being used in the final build, they're not in the way whatsoever, and we'll get back to that later. Right now I'm trimming the original piece of leather down to the size of the new piece of leather. Sorry, no, that's the reverse. I'm trimming down the new piece of leather down to the size of the old piece of leather to try and conserve as much of the character as possible of the bag, giving it a good rub here with some sandpaper to make sure the profile is as gorgeous as possible. Not really gorgeous, just respects the original profile of the bag as much as possible. Edge bevel here to make sure that we're getting rid of all the slight pieces of leather that might have been pushed up in the sanding process. Go ahead and dye it down to make sure that it's the same color as the rest, or close enough at least. Then I go ahead and use gum trag, or tokonol for some people, or tragicant gum, I'm not sure how you say it, and burnish it with a cloth. That, my friends, is my burnishing process as quickly as possible. I will sometimes add some beeswax to the burnished edges just to make them really strong and protect them. I think I did in this build, but I didn't show it to you guys, but yeah, that was quick. With the holes marked out, I am ready to go ahead and start stitching. It's not perfect. I had to punch some of these holes with an awl, and I usually use stitching irons which punch through perfectly, but in this case, because I didn't have a rigid surface to work on, so I can find my words there. Because I didn't have a rigid surface to work on, I had to go ahead and use an awl, and some of those holes are a bit not as straight as I'd like them to be, but hey, it'll do. It's a $6 builder's bag, and it's going to get mucked around anyway. The point is not to make it perfect, the point is to make it usable, functional, and the flap is now totally attached. And yeah, as I said, the color, I am really pleased about it. It is a bit darker than the rest of the bag, but bear in mind the bag has not been oiled yet, and that will make a huge difference by the end. Stitching, I'm happy with. It's nothing fancy. I'm using quite thick thread in this case because I knew that this is going to be a heavy duty bag, and I didn't really mind about having the best stitching possible. However, I did want something that was going to be sturdy, which is why I went ahead and used, I think the thread is something like 0.8 millimeters thick, which is decent for this kind of build, maybe a bit too big for most builds. Right now I'm trying to reproduce where the original rivets were, and I decided that, well, I wasn't really convinced about that, so I just went ahead and marked them out by eye. To be honest, that last hole is slightly too much to the right for my liking, and it's not perfect. Again, this will do. Marking out the second one as well, and hammering it through, just making sure that we've got all our holes ready for stitching. No, sorry, for the riveting. I couldn't find my words. I'm tired today, guys. I don't know why. And marking them down on the bag as well. Yeah, quite simple. This is the first time that I'm actually using rivets on a build, a real big build like this, where the rivets are one of the major assets. And for those of you who are looking to use rivets, I have to say it's a very enjoyable process. It does give you, I'm using copper rivets here, it does give you a really solid, tremendously solid hold in a very quick and easy manner. It takes about maybe 30 seconds per rivet if you're doing it properly, and it really works a treat. You can see here the new holes don't align up at all with the old holes, but it's not an issue. It really wasn't for me in this case, and more than that, I actually quite like seeing the old holes, seeing where the the repairs are in the new build, and yeah, I just really like this. So right now I'm figuring out where I want this last few holes for the attachment mechanisms. Nothing too fancy here. Overall, I have to say that this has been a very pleasurable build. As I said, I didn't know what to expect when I went into this. I was expecting to rebuild a lot more of this, actually, but figured out that by the time I'd cleaned it up, and there wasn't really that much I needed doing on this. I figured that the leather was in good enough condition. It really was just a question of dry leather. And the rest of the bag, well, apart from the front flap, well, the same issue. There's dry leather, and it needed a good bit of tender loving care, basically. That was pretty much it. So yeah, here we go for the final part of this whole build. I'm using, again, Fibing's 100% pure neatsfoot oil, just making sure it gets a really nice coat. And look how fast this leather just sinks in or drinks up this oil. It was ridiculous how much oil had to go into this. But I wasn't worried about giving it a real good amount of oil, maybe too much compared to what I'd normally use, or much more than what I'd normally use. But I figured that this bag had been abused over and over, probably hadn't been treated ever in its lifetime, or respected as it should ever. And I don't know how long it's been lying around in the junkyard or whatever, or wherever it has been lying around for the last few years, and decided that, well, it probably needed a huge amount of oil anyway. Following that, once it was a bit dry, I was using some LeFrenchCrafter grease, which is theoretically seal grease, but I believe that they've changed up the formula to use less animal fat and just different types of fat. But anyway, this is going to give you first of all, this is going to really help seal up the bag. It's going to make it impervious to rain, and it's going to protect it very nicely. Secondly, that plus the neatsfoot oil is going to make sure that the leather stays incredibly supple. And this is quite thick leather. It's about 2.5 millimeters thick, maybe a bit more, maybe a bit less, I'm not too sure. And the grease, the grease will really help protect it from elements, from everything, but also nourish it. So again, I went ahead and gave it a nice good coat of grease, let it dry, for a bit and then rubbed off the excess as much as possible, leaving always a small film of grease on it just because it's so dry. I knew it really needed it. So guys, without further ado, let's have a look at the final result of this builder's bag. And here you go. As you can see, the leather has darkened substantially and is looking much closer to the new flap. If you guys have any idea what those stains could be and how I could try and remove them in for future builds, if I have other things like this, please let me know. I'd love to have your input on this. I wasn't sure what to use. I was afraid that something like turpentine would be too aggressive for the leather and wouldn't actually get rid of the stains. If you've encountered similar problems like this, please let me know. I'd love to see or hear what you've been up to. As you can see, this leather is nice and supple now. It looks, I mean, it's taken a beating, a huge beating. It's been used and abused, but I just love the look on this. And yeah, as you can see, there's still a slight film of grease on that, but at least this bag should be usable for the next at least 5 years, 10 years, maybe a lifetime. Who knows if it's taken care of. So that's what I just love about leather. So hopefully you guys have enjoyed this little project. As you can see in a few seconds, this bag can actually be very useful. Now my girlfriend suggested making a picnic bag out of it. Well, it's not a bad idea, I suppose. You could add things inside to hold plates and glasses, but for me, I quite like using it as a camera bag, and I think it's going to be really fun to use over the next few years. So guys, if you've liked this video, do let me know in the comments below. If you have any suggestions about how I could improve my work and my videos and my builds, again, please let me know. And in the meantime, guys, thanks for watching. Hope you've enjoyed. I'll see you next time.